Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Small Business Forum with Commissioner David Lehman. I'm Chris Conway, the Executive Director of the West Hartford Chamber of Commerce. Today's program is being brought to you by the West Hartford Chamber of Commerce and the town of West Hartford. It is available on Zoom, Facebook Live, YouTube Live, and West Hartford Community Interactive. With us today, we have Department of Community and Economic Development Commissioner David Lehman. He also serves as the Governor's Senior Financial Advisor, and we welcome him today to answer your questions. And before I kick it over, Commissioner, I just want to thank you for all the hard work you are doing and all of the resources that your department is providing for our small businesses. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kristen Gorski. Before I do that, just wanted to let you know that you can put your questions in the Q&A box, and we will try to get to as many of those as possible. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the town of West Hartford's Economic Development Specialist, Kristen Gorski.
Thank you, Chris. And I also wanted to, share in Chris's sentiment. Thank you so much to Commissioner Lehman and your staff for being so great and responsive through all of this. And we really appreciate your time today. We welcome all of our businesses, a wide variety of them, and we hope that this is a useful, chunk of your time, of your day. We thank you for taking the time. We know everybody is very busy. So thank you again. And as Chris said, I'll be monitoring the chat box throughout this. So please let me know any questions that you have. We're hoping to get those addressed today. And then I am happy to introduce Mayor Sherry Cantor, who would like to say a couple words.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Chris and Kristen for organizing this. Thank you to the Commissioner for your incredible work, and to all the businesses that are planning on how they're going to, sort of capture this new reopening, this new phase in a safe way, and protect their customers, their employees, and their residents. I want to say that when I've listened to the Commissioner a number of times when he came on board. There was so much excitement about his plans to spur economic development for the state of Connecticut, great ideas. And then the advanced CT will launch February 3rd, the rebranding, and then things changed so dramatically. And I know that you've been on the front lines of so much of what's happened, and there's many resources and regular communications that have come out. You've worked tirelessly on behalf of all of the businesses for Connecticut. We're honored to have you here for us, give us your guidance and your insight. And I'm really excited to hear from you again. Thank you to all the businesses, and we don't want to waste our time. We have precious time with our Commissioner. So Commissioner Lehman, to you.
Well, Mayor, thank you very much, Kristen. I appreciate the very warm introduction here, and great to be with everyone, at least virtually, in West Hartford, and hopefully maybe later this summer, this fall, we'll be able to do this in person. It feels like it's been such a long time since I've had one of those meetings, but this is the new normal, and I think we're all learning how to adapt to it in our personal lives and our business lives. So I wanted to make a few comments here, and then certainly we can get into questions. Perhaps it's a bit anticlimactic for those that saw Governor Lamont's press conference or read the news on Governor Lamont's press conference last night, where we really talked about the second phase and the third phase. So Connecticut is officially in reopening right now. But before I get into that, I just want to back up a little bit. So we're 2 odd months into this crisis, this public health crisis. And as the mayor mentioned, the best laid plans certainly change very, very quickly. Our focus in Hartford at the government side of things has been to make sure that we can make sure our citizens are protected and safe. But as we focused on reopen, and I would say probably mid-April, maybe even early April, we went from spending 80 or 90% of our time on the first phase, which I call response or triage to the crisis. And there you saw lots of executive orders, things that could be done in terms of deferring payments, deferring taxes, loans at the state level and the federal level. That was really the first phase. And I would say that we really started focusing on the second phase, which is reopen, right around Easter, thereabouts. At that point in time, we started the Reopen Committee, which has 48 members in total across the private sector as well as the public sector and nonprofits. And importantly, that committee got to work right away, and we wanted to make sure that Connecticut had a best-in-class reopening plan. If you go back to the stay-at-home order, the stay safe, stay home order that Lamont put in place in March, one of the things Connecticut was very deliberate at was trying to continue as much commerce and activity as we thought appropriate given the virus. So the governor mentions this very often, but for example, retail, we've always enabled curbside pickup or delivery for all of our retailers. That is unique, certainly among Northeastern states. Many of them just shut down what they called, quote, non-essential retail. We wanted to offer opportunities for our retailers to make some amount of money. We realize how hard this is for the business community. But things like construction and manufacturing, we enabled those areas of the economy to stay open. We made decisions that we thought were appropriate. And that is different again versus our other states. So we tried to leave more of our economy open because we realize how tough it is to restart an economy once it's shut down. So that was a decision that the governor made in March. And here we are, day 2, I guess, into our reopening. So phase 1 happened yesterday. As folks are aware, outside dining was part of that. Retail for browsing and in-store purchasing is part of that. As well as outdoor recreation and a number of other things. So that is the initial phase. And the governor uses the term baby steps. We think it's really important to restart our economy, but it's important that we do it gradually and slowly because confidence is so important. We've done a lot of surveying of Connecticut residents trying to understand their willingness to go to a restaurant, their willingness to go to a hair salon. And what we see is a significant portion of the population is still reluctant. And we think that will change as and when more time passes and consumers see the new behavior at shops, at restaurants, where masks, hygiene, social distancing, plexiglass, we've all seen it in the grocery stores. And that's an analog I like to use because grocery stores from that last week in March or the second to last week in March versus where they are today, we've all seen that transition where they've become experts at kind of the new normal and keeping everyone safe, employees as well as customers. So, the governor wanted to have that first phase. And one of the things I do think it's important to mention here that we're really trying to strike the right balance is what I call the East versus West divide here, which is, our reopen plans are very consistent with our Eastern neighbors. So if you look at what we did yesterday and what we're going to do in phase 2, we're very similar to Rhode Island and Massachusetts from a timing perspective. We're ahead of Massachusetts right now in terms of what we've enabled, but very similar to Rhode Island. But if you look to the West, New York and New Jersey in particular, given the density of virus there, they are going to be doing things a lot more slowly than Connecticut. And we talk a lot about what does that mean for the western part of the state. Do you have people coming up from New York City to get haircuts, to go to restaurants? And from an economic perspective, obviously that sounds great, but from an epidemiological perspective, we get concerned when we talk about that flow of people from a virus spread perspective. So we can talk more about that in Q&A, but I think that's going to be a key as we go into phase 2 and phase 3 is what is the right balance given the density of virus and how our western neighbors are thinking about it in the western part of the state versus the eastern part of the state. Shifting to phase 2, which was announced yesterday. So phase 2, a significant portion of our economy, I want to say it's close to 15 or 20% of GDP will be open. So that is restaurants for inside dining, lodging, all gyms, fitness clubs, indoor, as well as the outdoor ones, which we're enabling right now. All personal services. So we've gotten a lot of questions on this. I think, Kristen, you may have forwarded me a couple. So haircuts are going to be allowed on June 1st. Other personal services, so everything from tattoos, spa services, waxing, piercings, all of that will be allowed on June 20th. Some states have bifurcated that or even trifurcated into 3 different phases. We went with haircuts first. There was a lot of debate. We can talk about that here too on haircuts and the timing of that, but all personal services will be open on June 20th. In addition to that, movie theaters, bowling alleys, outdoor amusement parks, what I would say is most of what was closed in the stay-at-home order in March will be opened in June with a few exceptions. The exceptions in phase 3 are bars, large indoor spaces for venues and events. There's still a lot of focus, in particular inside, on lots of people congregating and what that means in terms of the risk or the potential risk of the virus. So that's really what's been held out, but we're going to open really the balance of the economy on June 20th. But it's going to be subject to very strict protocols and rules, like what we've seen for restaurants and retail. And we're going to roll those out. We're going to try to do that by the end of the first week in June. So one of the big work streams we're doing right now is for these phase 2 businesses in particular, what are the rules going to be? And we're going to work with employers and employees to develop best practices. We're obviously looked at other states on how they've done this in other countries. So that's a big work stream that's happening at DECD right now. One other thing I want to point out in addition to this east-west divide, when we look at other states versus Connecticut on the reopen plan, is the timing between phases. So many states had 2 weeks, some had 3 weeks. Massachusetts just announced 3 weeks on Monday. We do have 4 weeks between phases, and we've spent a lot of time on this. We think it's right because the concern is if you only have 2 or 3 weeks between phases, how this virus transmits, the incubation period of the virus, when you're going to get what the epidemiologists call signal, when you're going to see if there's increased transmission. We think that's really tough to do in 2 or 3 weeks. And as we saw in March, when the genie gets out of the bottle here, so to speak, you really can't put it back anytime soon. And we do not want to go back into a lockdown or a quasi-lockdown. So we think it's smart to have 4 weeks or at least 4 weeks between our phases, especially as we start to encourage more activity here in phase 1 and then going from phase 2 to phase 3. There's certainly some thought that there could be less transmission over the summer as you have a hotter environment. We just don't know is the answer. So we really want to make sure that we can measure the increased transmission when it happens. We realize some of that's going to happen as more people are going to be doing activity. There's going to be more interaction. So I did want to address that because if you look at Massachusetts, for example, again, they have 3 phases to their plan, and their last phase ends June 29th at this point in time. Our second phase will basically be June 20th. Now, most of what they're allowing on June 8th or June 29th, we're allowing on June 20th and then some, but the phasing timing is really important to us. Just a couple things, and I'm just thinking back to the questions, Kristen, that you sent me. We've had a lot of questions around PPP loans and rehiring folks to get the forgiveness on PPP. So just to step back, so Connecticut's almost 60,000 Connecticut businesses of the roughly 100,000 that we think are eligible have gotten PPP loans. There's still a little less than $100 billion of availability. So for those that haven't gotten PPP loans, we would encourage it. We think it's a really great product and certainly a significant amount of money is coming into the state. The average loan size for those PPP loans in Connecticut's roughly 125 or 130,000, I believe, currently. But the question, so many are probably familiar, but maybe for those that are not, 75% of that loan needs to go towards payroll and qualified payroll expenses for the loan to be forgiven and become a grant. So you need to rehire your workforce to do that. And given unemployment and how unemployment's working now with the $600 plus up through the end of July, it has been tough for certain employers to offer their jobs back, especially as we emerge here. The way the unemployment rules work on that right now is if someone is offered a qualified job or a job that's appropriate for them, they're not over 65, for example, we're telling them to stay home. They don't have a high risk, a comorbidity, which we're telling them to stay home. But if it's suitable employment where there isn't that health risk, that job needs to be offered back to the individual. And then at that point in time, they're not able to, again, they can contest it, but outside of if it's suitable employment, they're not going to be able to get the unemployment benefits anymore. Now, we realize that this is happening slowly and there's a lot of anxiety, understandably, out there. But I think re-engaging with one's employees and trying to start the process of getting them back online with the PPP loans is really, really important. We're still working through it, as are other states. This is not unique to Connecticut. It is happening all over the place. But we think as more people get comfortable coming back to work, there should be less friction on this point. And certainly the end of that $600 plus up is also in sight here. So this is going to happen slowly, like everything else. We've seen this in other states, but engaging early with your employees, we think is really important on the PPP loan and the rehiring front. So I'll stop there just in the spirit of time and happy to get into 15 or 20 minutes of questions here.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Commissioner. So if you could just touch on, and that was a really great explanation as it pertains to unemployment with the PPP loan. Could you just touch on and give some advice in terms of what employers should do if they still are continuing to have challenges with actually attempting to rehire those employees and them just declining? So what track should they go down if that happens?
Well, my understanding, and I'm not a labor expert here, but my understanding is there is a process at the Department of Labor if employers are going to contest unemployment claims because they've offered, again, suitable work. I'm using very specific words because this is my understanding. There's a process and an adjudication process. But if it's suitable work that doesn't pose an unreasonable health risk to the individual, then they can go and contest the claim with the Department of Labor. We all know our Department of Labor, like every other Department of Labor, is backed up. So that could take some time. And there is a process there that needs to happen. So I don't believe that can happen quickly based on everything I know. But I would reach out to the Department of Labor. And the process to get that started is to contest the unemployment claims because you feel that you've offered that work back to the employee.
Perfect. Thank you. And then can you just touch on the status of the state bridge loans?
Sure. So the bridge loan program, there's been 2 tranches of funding that have happened or in the process of happening. We worked with, so stepping back, we initially were going to do 25 million of these bridge loans. We saw, I think, 300 million or 250 million in potential demand. We doubled the size from 25 to 50. We started working with SoFi, which is Social Finance. It's a San Francisco-based fintech lender to help us process and then ultimately disperse the loans. My expectation is when all is said and done, we'll make close to 2,000 loans across the state. The interesting thing with this process and why we worked with SoFi, we didn't feel that the manual process that the state has historically had just wouldn't put the money out as quickly as possible. So the first tranche was paid out, approvals were notified right around May 1 or that second week in May. And then I believe that first tranche was dispersed last week or started to be dispersed last week. The one thing we're encountering with the bridge loans at the state level is we're doing these in waves. It's not being done 1 or 2 at a time. So there was a big first wave. I think there was 800 or 900 loans that were made. The second wave is happening right now because we're basically doing this in a process where there's a form document and we're trying to use as much technology and automation as possible. We expect everything to be wrapped up by the end of this month in terms of all the monies that go out. And then we'll make a determination. Do we do another round of this or do we not? What we found, interestingly, is with the PPP program, where there's been $6.7 billion into the state across these almost 60,000 businesses. And on the emergency loan front for SBA, Connecticut actually is the second, and I don't think the governor mentioned this yesterday, Connecticut has the second highest emergency SBA loans per capita, only to California. So what that means is 400 million in loans across, I think it was 13, I forget the exact number of businesses, but per capita, we were second in that regard. I think it was 30,000 businesses, a little over 30,000 businesses got these loans, and those are low interest, they're non-forgivable loans. But what we found with the state bridge loan is over 2/3 of the people that applied for the state loan also applied for PPP and potentially got PPP. So we've actually seen folks decline the state loans, which we didn't expect initially. This just goes to show you how quickly stuff changes from end of March to now, where the federal resources, again, we're talking about 50 million at the state level. Obviously the federal checkbook is much bigger, but between, I think when all said and done, between PPP and the EIDL program, there'll be close to $8.5 billion from the federal government into Connecticut small businesses.
That is a crazy amount. Excellent. Thank you. So I know that you had touched upon the second phase of reopening, specifically the question that I had sent regarding med spas and those types of salons. So the question is for businesses who understand that they cannot reopen, who are finding like businesses who are trying to push to reopen or advertising that they're reopening in advance of when they can. Are there repercussions for those businesses that are opening in advance?
Yeah, there are. And we've gotten a lot of questions on this, in particular around personal services. So there is an enforcement mechanism in place, which starts off, and the governor detailed this a little bit yesterday. The enforcement mechanism is initially we're going to be warning businesses and educating if they're open or if they're not following the rules and safety protocols. They should be told that they either can't be open or they need to follow those protocols. The second order is, depending on the type of business, the local health inspectors have been enabled to basically close businesses down that aren't following rules and protocols where they have oversight. So that is, restaurants, salons, tattoo parlors, wherever the local health inspector has existing authority. And then for businesses where that is not the case, for example, office or a bookstore or retail, the chief elected official. So Mayor Cantor has the ability to designate whether it's a fire chief, a building inspector, other people in town to basically as her designee, and they have that same authority, which is they have the ability to close businesses that aren't complying for the duration of the public health emergency, which right now is through the early September, I believe.
Great, thank you.
Again, sorry, just on that point, we don't. When I say that, we don't want to do that, right? We understand how hard this has been on business. We want people to come back, but we can't have folks doing stuff that's unsafe or against the executive order. So we hope that there's a lot of warnings or no warnings given out, and that's the end of it. But the last thing we want to happen is there is a public health issue. There's a super spreader event at a restaurant, for example, or a retail shop. That's the last thing we want to happen. So everyone needs to take this very seriously. So again, we don't want to shut businesses down, but we feel it's imperative that we have that type of stick, because compliance is so important here for us to recover, and it's best for all of our businesses and our economy.
Thank you. And I will also add one of our local health inspectors. I'll put their contact information in the chat for everybody who's on here as an attendee. Let's see, going through the question, I'm just going to read this out for you. Who can advocate to keep telehealth insurance options available through 2020? It's been close to 2 months, and independent contractors are being threatened by insurance companies to stop covering telehealth services in June 2020. Who can address this?
But just one thing, I want to confirm one thing before I address that. I misspoke before. I said 30,000 businesses in Connecticut have gotten the small business, the EIDL loan. It's around 4,000 that have gotten it, and close to 60,000 have gotten the PPP loan. So I just wanted to clarify that, but it's still $400 million of the emergency loan have come into the state. On the telehealth front, so Vicki Veltri heads the Office of Health Strategy. And listen, telehealth, my opinion on this, and I'm not as deep into kind of the issues with the insurance companies and how they're thinking about it, but I do think telehealth, dental care, even, you're going to see a real change in how people do business, and I think telehealth is something we will see. I do think it's here to stay. But for those that want to advocate in terms of how it's handled, Vicki Veltri at the Office of Health Strategy and her team are the right folks to reach out to make sure that you're weighing in on what you'd like to see there.
Thank you. I have another question. So I think that this is as it pertains to unemployment and PPP. If getting employees back to work, but they have kids, how does that work? No school equals no available parents.
Yeah, so this is a really challenging one, and we've gotten this feedback and heard it in a lot of areas. So where there is, one of the interesting things that's come out in the CARES Act is there is family leave that is afforded to individuals where there is a child that's home that typically would be in school. So there are federal dollars that come through the employer for that. I believe it's, if I'm not mistaken, I believe it's a 2/3 pay though after 2 weeks. So as opposed to full pay, similar to unemployment without the plus up, it is not at full pay, but there is, I think, up to 10 weeks, if I'm not mistaken. I need to confirm this, but there is through that Family Medical Leave and Paid Leave Act, because there is an understanding that not everyone can go back, and our childcare, for young childcare, at least, it's only operating at around 60% or so capacity. We think that's increasing a lot, but that federal leave bill is going to be the best tool for folks to continue to get paid through their employer if they're staying home and cannot go back to work because of childcare responsibilities, or for that matter, if you're caring for an adult and someone that may have the virus. So that's the best tool for that.
Thank you. Another question on PPP as it pertains to not being able to get employees to come back to work. Suggestions on how employers can spend that 75% that's required to be spent on payroll. And also, if they can't do that, is there an opportunity for that loan to be extended?
So it's a great question, and it needs to be spent on payroll. The language is very clear on that, right? The intent of this program was to basically keep folks on your payroll for 2 months. And then initially the thought was, we'll be back to normal. This was the thought at the end of March or beginning of March. Obviously, it's going to be very slow to come back. So it needs to be spent on payroll. And this was thought to be in lieu of unemployment. So all of a sudden, when that 2-month period is over, when the virus is over, you can kind of get right back to where we were. Now, obviously, that's not exactly happening, but the 75% does need to be spent on payroll expenses, benefits associated with payroll is eligible too. There's no way around that, and there's been some discussion around changing or providing more time to the question to get folks back, as opposed to that clock that starts right away when the loan gets funded. But no change has been made at this point in time from DC on that regard. So as soon as folks have gotten funded, trying to get folks back on the payroll ASAP is really, really important. Otherwise, the loan isn't forgiven and needs to be repaid. It's a 1% interest rate, but repaying a $100,000 loan versus a $100,000 grant, obviously that's very, very different.
Thank you. So the last question that I see, and if anybody else has any other questions, please enter them. I think we have about 5 more minutes before the commissioner has to jump off. So it's been very challenging, obviously, from a financial perspective for small businesses, and there's a lot of loan and opportunities out there that people have been jumping on. However, people who are having difficulty in working with their landlords and having their landlords not be responsive to any sort of concerns that they have. Are there any suggestions on that front?
Yeah, that's a good question. So this comes up a lot. So just one thing before I touch on that. So on the PPP loans, rent or interest on your mortgage is an eligible expense. So that 25% that's not for payroll, we obviously, that's one of the benefits of PPP is you will have money for rent, and that can be part of the overall forgiveness package if 75% is spent on payroll. So with landlords, what my best advice is, obviously there aren't any evictions happening because the judicial overall system is basically shut down, but people still can be late on rent on the commercial side, and we realize how challenging that is. The best success, and listen, all landlords are different, and there's different circumstances up and down the chain in terms of bills to pay across the board. But for landlords, what we've suggested is, being very transparent and reaching out, saying, here's why I can't pay my rent this month. Here's why I need 2 months grace period. We're not open. Here's what our books look like. Here's what's happening here. I think transparency and reaching out and explaining exactly why is the best thing. What I've found, because the reality is from a landlord's perspective, it's not like there's a whole bunch of other tenants that want to come into these shopping centers or malls right now, right? Everyone's in the same boat. This is kind of a systemic issue that we're dealing with. So I shake my head when I hear about a landlord that wants to be really aggressive, because no one else is. It's not like they're gonna re-tenant the space right away, right? They should be aligned with tenants, keeping tenants that can pay and can get their business up and running. Keep them in the space and work with them. So I would just encourage transparency. And the one other thing I'd mention is the property tax relief that was offered through an executive order. That some of that was extended to commercial tenants, and this was an executive order that was done in early April. But for those tenants to get property tax relief, in terms of either the 90-day grace period or the lower penalty rate that's out there, they need to offer a commensurate amount of that benefit to their tenants. So if on the property tax front, the landlord is taking advantage of that deferral, they need to give some portion of it through to their tenant. So those again, ideally we don't make this adversarial, because I think if we can do this consensually, it's better. But ultimately, if landlords are taking advantage of that property tax relief, they need to be sharing some of that with the tenants, and that could mean grace period.
Thank you. Another question. As a massage therapist, we found out yesterday that we are a part of phase 2 reopening. Hairdressers were notified less than 24 hours before their open date was moving. As we prepare, how can we be able to be certain of our opening date?
It's a great question. And listen, the hairdresser thing, we did not intend to do that. We made a difficult decision there, which I think was the right one. But our goal is to provide as much certainty and as much timing in advance as we can. So June 20th, I think the only thing that's going to change the June 20th date is if the 5 health metrics that we outlined yesterday are not fulfilled. So that was in the governor's press conference yesterday, where we talked about declining transmission, hospital capacity, and the like that needs to be there. But outside of that, I do not envision us changing the June 20th date. We understand how harmful that is when you get your shop ready and you have appointments lined up. Again, that's not our intention. So the only thing that I believe will change it is if the virus starts to get worse and we don't meet the metrics, which means none of the June 20th start will happen.
Great, thank you. And last one, because I know that you have to jump off. Your time is very valuable. Commissioner, PPP, can we pay higher hourly rates or hazard pay to convince our staff to come back from unemployment?
So we're getting very technical here. I don't believe so. I would encourage folks to look at the Treasury rules on that, because how the loans were sized, they were sized based on empirical or kind of the historical payroll numbers. So, to pay, take it to its extreme. Can you bring half the people back at twice the salary to kind of come up with that same payroll? I believe that's not allowed, but I would encourage folks to look at the actual Treasury regs on that. I don't know the specifics of that one, but that's my understanding is that's not, but they should confirm through the regs.
Perfect. Thank you. So I don't see any more questions, and I know that you have to run. So I just really wanted to thank you so much for taking the time. You are such an outstanding resource for all of our businesses. I'm sure that this was, again, a very valuable chunk of time for these businesses to be on this call. So we appreciate you answering a wide variety of questions here, and always appreciate your support. Any closing out words that you'd like to say, Commissioner?
No, I appreciate you guys having me here in West Hartford again virtually, and I appreciate everything all the small business owners are doing to get our economy going again. So it's we're going to get there again. We're moving as fast as we can at the state level, and the governor, as a small business owner, someone who comes from business, he understands it. So we're really trying to move as fast as possible, but making sure folks are safe. And if you look at us versus our peer states, that's what you're seeing. We're going as fast as we can.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, with that, we wanted to thank you very much. I will kick it back over to Chris for any closing words. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, guys.
And thank you again, Commissioner, for your time and all the work you're doing. And I just want to remind everybody that a lot of what the Commissioner talked about are available on the state's website, which is ct.gov, the Chamber's website, which is whchamber.com, and the town's website, westhartfordct.gov as well. So thank you. And Mayor, would you like to say anything before we close out?
And just a very, very big thank you for all that you are doing for businesses in Connecticut, your hard work, your tireless work, your communication. I know we have a long way to go. Stay healthy, be well, and we wish you all the best. Thank you so much.
Thank you.